Boa tarde a todos. Me escutam? Bem-vindos a mais esse encontro do Tiaços, um encontro super importante para a gente. Eu vou contar um pouquinho como é que foi a história até chegarmos hoje aqui. Então, o nosso curador oficial do Tiaços, o Marcos Quintais, mirou, nesse momento, do livro que o Christopher e a Tiffany lançaram nesse ano. E desde então a gente começou a tentar marcar a data, né, para conseguir fazer esse encontro. É um tema super importante mesmo para o público brasileiro, que está em pauta, que a gente está preocupado. Então a gente se esforçou muito, e o Christopher muito gentilmente foi costurando as possibilidades de data, até ele chegar no dia de hoje, chegar antes do dia de hoje, ele chegou dizendo que viria a Tiffany, o que me deixou muito feliz quando ele falou que viria a Tiffany, porque a Tiffany eu encontrei em Buenos Aires. A primeira vez que eu vi a Tiffany foi num jantar, num dos restaurantes mais importantes lá, mais cobiçados de Buenos Aires, um jantar organizado pelo Stephanie Carpani. Fomos lá, nós, a Tiffany e eu comendo berinjela, cenoura, o pão, né? Deixamos as pessoas um pouco indignadas, porque nós só comemos isso no restaurante mais importante nós tomamos o vinho, né, Tiffany? E aí, logo em seguida, eu fui assistir a palestra dela lá no Congresso, né? E a palestra dela, uma palestra lindíssima, que falava, o tema da palestra era No Vazio, uma amplificação sobre a vulnerabilidade e a intimidade analítica do mito de duas irmãs, Inanna e Ereshkigal. E eu conheci, então, a Tiffany, a doçura, a simpatia e a potência dela de uma vez só. Então, eu fiquei muito feliz de tê-la junto com o Christopher aqui no encontro de hoje. Bom, então esses são os nossos convidados. Eu vou ler os currículos deles agora para vocês. O Christopher é um psicanalista licenciado, certificado em análise junguiana, com prática privada em Nova York. Dr. Carter tem mais de 30 anos de experiência e liderança na concepção e implementação de habitação e serviços de saúde mental para os sem-teto crônicos que vivem com doenças mentais graves e persistentes. Enquanto completava seu programa de treinamento psicanalítico, Dr. Carter escreveu Tempo para um Espaço na Mesa, Reflexões em primeira mão de um analista afro-nativo americano em treinamento. Um apelo para que a IAAP denuncie publicamente, mas não apague, os escritos supremacistas brancos de Jung. Ganhador do prêmio Gradiva de 2021, categoria Melhor Trabalho de Estudante. Dr. Carter é coeditor da publicação Teoria e Racismo Sistematizado, Reflexões de uma comunidade americana de aprendizagem psicanalítica. Ele vai começar a apresentação dele, e logo em seguida vem a Tiffany. Eu já vou deixar os dois apresentados. A Tiffany é uma psicanalista licenciada, analista junguiana, certificada com prática privada na cidade de Nova York. Ela é autora de História através do Trauma, História e Contra-História na Bíblia Hebraica, autora, colaboradora na publicação Lockdown Therapy, coeditora de Teoria Junguiana e Racismo Sistematizado, Reflexões de uma comunidade americana de aprendizagem psicanalítica, e autora de vários artigos publicados em periódicos, incluindo Um Próprio Ventre, Trauma, o Transcendente e a Transferência no Fenômeno Borderline, na intersecção dos estudos de gênero e sexualidade, psicanálise, religião e trauma. Dr. Houck atua como atual diretora de treinamento e é membro do corpo docente da Associação Psicanalítica Junguiana da cidade de Nova York. Muito bem-vindos ao nosso Tiaços, é uma honra, um prazer, uma alegria imensa recebê-los. A palavra está com vocês.
Thank you very, very much, Luciana. We want to thank the entire Theasos, I wanted to say planning committee, but it's probably just Theasos, Marcus, Luciano, and Isa, for the honor of this presentation. Of course, I also extend my gratitude, continuous gratitude to Tiffany for her kinship, for her partnership with the book, and for her commitment to opening up the analytic paradigm for greater inclusivity. Last but not least, we want to express our gratitude for all the concern, for your time, and for your being present, those who are attending. And for the sake of conversation, we're going to get straight to the presentation. Just checking. Can you see the presentation? Thank you.
See.
The feeling of race. Thank you very much. One more question. How do you say thank you in Brazilian, in Portuguese? Obrigado. Obrigado. The concept race greatly impacts the analytic paradigm. Jung's writings, like those of other pioneers of Western thought, wrote in support of this error. It's the same Jung who teaches us that we're prone to align with the attitudes of those whom we revere. I hope that we can learn 3 points from my presentation. Number one, that race biology has been discredited by genetic research for decades, and that since race has more to do with attitudes and perceptions than with biology, it's a matter for psychoanalytic exploration. Third, analytic theorists and instructors have a responsibility to re-educate the collective about the toxicity of the attitude of white supremacy, because Jung's opus continues to promote it. The feeling of race. In her book, The Wrath to Come, Sarah Churchwell writes that the feeling of race is a feeling associated with separation, suppressed psychopolitical realities, lies, distortions, justifications, half-truths, rampant projections, cognitive dissonances, flat denials, all around stinging truths we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves. Race is an obscure, ill-defined concept. Research in various fields has repeatedly found that race is a rationalized system of world dominance, cloaked by a theory of natural selection and evolution. It emits no feeling in and of itself. And since feelings are connected to behaviors and attitudes, it may be more appropriate to talk of the feeling of racializing. Associated feelings of racializing include disgust, aversion, anger, with concurrent feelings of contempt and unquenchable grief. 75 years ago, in a memorandum to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, entitled Techniques of Attitude Change Conducive to World Peace, Jung wrote, "Psychology as it is taught and practiced at the C.G. Jung Institute for Analytical Psychology, Zurich, can be described as a technique for changing the mental attitude. It's a method by which not only neurosis and functional psychoses can be treated, but also all sorts of mental and moral conflicts in normal people." Following World War II, you see, UNESCO adopted a resolution to promote, quote unquote, inquiries into modern methods which have been developed in education, political science, philosophy, and psychology for changing mental attitudes, and into the social and political circumstances which favor the employment of a particular technique. Amongst those commissions to provide a memorandum were the International Psychoanalytic Association, the Tavistock Institution of Human Relations, and the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich. In the year of its creation, 1945, the UN created an agency for education. We already spoke of UNESCO, which was the successor of the League of Nations International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. In its first year, UNESCO's constitution had a preamble that identifies racism as one of the social evils to combat. UNESCO published the following statement: race, which directly affects millions of human lives and causes countless conflicts, is rooted in the mind. World War II was made possible by the doctrine of the inequality of men and races. A resolution adopted by the UN Social and Economic Council at its sixth session in 1948 called upon UNESCO to work towards proposing and recommending the general adoption of a program of dissemination of scientific facts designed to bring about the disappearance of that which is commonly called race prejudice. In 1949, UNESCO's General Conference resulted in the adoption of 3 resolutions. 1, to study and collect scientific material concerning questions about race. 2, to give wide diffusion to the scientific material collected. And 3, to prepare an educational campaign based on this information. UNESCO scientists unanimously denounced racist dogma as absurd. They conclude that knowledge of the truth does not always help change emotional attitudes, which draw their real strength from the subconscious. They called it the subconscious. But knowledge of the truth can prevent rationalization of reprehensible behaviors. To UNESCO, racism is a particularly vicious and mean expression of the caste spirit. It involves belief in the innate and absolute superiority of an arbitrarily defined human group over other equally arbitrarily defined groups. Instead of being based on scientific facts, it's generally maintained in defiance of the scientific method. As an ideology and feeling, racism is by its nature aggressive. The feeling of race is aggression. It would be better, they say, when speaking of human races, to drop the term race altogether and speak of ethnic groups. Now, given the degrees of cultural opportunity to realize their potentialities, the average achievement of each member or the members of each ethnic group is about the same. There's no definite evidence that there exist inborn differences between human groups. There's evidence that whatever group differences might exist are greatly overridden by the individual differences and by influences of environmental factors. Personality and character are raceless. The biological differences between ethnic groups should be distinguished from the myth of race. I use the word myth loosely. Race is not a myth, but the construct of race. The unity of mankind from both the biological and social viewpoints is the main theme. The feeling of our paradigm. In techniques of attitude change conducive to world peace, Jung informed UNESCO of archetypes, dominant emotional tendencies in human nature, which cannot be ruled by reason. These tendencies are exceedingly dynamic and of an ambivalent nature. If properly understood, they form a most welcome and useful support and a vis a tergo to conscious convictions and decisions. If misunderstood or misdirected, they paralyze and blindfold people, pushing them into mass psychosis. That's a quote from Jung, volume 18, paragraph 1389. Jung tells us that the analytic method observes attitude as both a mental and a moral problem. An attitude is governed and sustained by dominant conscious idea, accompanied by feeling tone, an emotional value. This is a quote from Jung. A man's attitude cannot be changed unless he takes account of the most questionable and painful aspects of his own character. A change of attitude never starts with a group, but only with an individual. Jung spoke to the attitudinal imbalance behind the atrocities, but does he ever denounce race biology or racism outright? A promotional tension of correspondences is virtually absent from Jung's race discourse. With the racist rants we have reviewed so far, is it legitimate to establish that he was trying to secure analytic neutrality? What's missing possibly is there were a bunch of quotes I had to take out of the speech to conserve time, but you can find them in the book. Yolanda Jacobi included part of Jung's memorandum in the Institute's document to UNESCO on June 23rd, 1948, to have the document included in a conference discussion on methods of attitude change conducive to international understanding. But the Institute's memorandum was excluded from the conference agenda. UNESCO would go on to publish its own statement on race in 1950. Regarding our moral responsibility, Graham Richards in 1997 wrote, "Necessary racism, my racialism, occurs because, given psychology's reflexive nature, psychologists who are members of culturally and psychologically racist communities will necessarily share that community's psychological character in some degree. Even the most consciously anti-racist people may appear retrospectively racist in this sense." UNESCO discredited race biology in 1950. But around 1954, Jung approved a transcript that would eventually be published 2 months after his death. The transcript captured a discussion from 1939 with the Guild of Pastoral Psychology. It includes the following. "I have been led by dreams like any primitive. I am ashamed to say so, but I'm as primitive as any." I'm not going to say it because I do not know. The offense is justified in footnote 11. This offensive term was not invariably derogatory in earlier British and continental usage, and definitely not in this case. But that bigoted attitude aligns with the more violent comment he made in 1932 in a seminar 70 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. In an unapologetic comment, without an asterisk, he says certain people deserve that you should not be kind. You indulge in your own autoerotic pleasure, warming yourself by the thought of your wonderful kindness. But you're wronging those people. You're leading them into error. So you need a certain amount of cruelty. Those Negroes are murderous devils who might kill other people as well as yourself. So why should they be free? They'd far better be chained. There's enough in Jung's catalog to reveal that in a way that would be considered common or expected, Jung routinely targeted the Negro and the red man as pejoratively primitive, with a particular disdain for the Negro. Not everyone of Jung's time shared such disdain to the point that they would pepper their opus with pejorative declarations that propagandized race and racial superiority. Jung's expressed attitude towards people of color was often consonant with an attitude of white supremacy. According to Powell, 2018, racial identifications that maintain whiteness as a construct privileged over others are an obstacle to conducing analytic work. In 1989, legal scholar Francis Lee Ansley offered a helpful definition of white supremacy. By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Participation in the propaganda and activities of an established hate group is not a prerequisite for white supremacy. How might those who fully align with Jung preconsciously identify with a supremacist attitude? In 29, Jung explained this. He said, the attitude or disposition then can thrust itself on consciousness from outside or from inside, like an affect, and can therefore be expressed by the same figures of speech. An attitude seems at first glance to be something very much more complicated than an affect. On closer inspection, however, we find that this is not so, because most attitudes are based consciously or unconsciously, on some kind of maxim, which often has the character of a proverb. In some attitudes, one can immediately detect the underlying maxim and even discover where it was picked up. Often the attitude is distinguished only by a single word, which as a rule stands for an idea. Not infrequently, the quintessence of an attitude is neither a maxim nor an idea, but a personality who is revered and emulated. In the essay, originally titled You're Negroid and Indian Behavior, which was retitled The Complications of American Psychology, Jung writes something that holds a particular charge 62 years after his death. Racial infection is the most serious mental and moral problem where the primitive outnumbers the white man. America has this problem only in a relative degree because the whites far outnumber the colored. Apparently, he can assimilate the primitive influence with little risk to himself. What would happen if there were a considerable increase in the colored population is another matter. Through the fallacy of bioracism, biases are reified as though they're aligned with nature, an expression of evolution or the spiritual growth of humanity. Such a bigoted statement from a scientific authority effectively supports white supremacy. Analytic theory proposes that binaries, coincidentia oppositorum, arise within the psyche to stroke tensions that promote a new path and a new attitude. A promotional tension of correspondences is virtually absent from Jung's race discourse, yet he warns us that nobody is immune to nationwide evil unless he is unshakably convinced of the danger of his own character being tainted by the same evil. Now, by change of attitude, Jung informs us, quote unquote, we must emphasize that we understand by this the change brought about through the integration of formerly unconscious contents into consciousness. Such an addition inevitably involves a change that is felt as such. The change is never neutral. It's essentially an increase of consciousness, and it depends entirely upon the individual's character, what form it will ultimately take. It is, when it comes to the worst, an inoculation with one's own virtue. It's a challenge to the whole man, and it must be considered a risk, the risk involved in the further development of man's consciousness, unquote. We can all lay claim to unconscious biases, and we all benefit from becoming increasingly tolerant of those slippery, shadowy aspects of the self that are readily projected, thereby interjecting the abject self aspects that may contain metaphorical gold if we can just take it back, aligning one to a path towards greater wholeness. It's unproductive to assert that Jung was unconsciously biased about his racist views. He was quite cognizant of his biases and repeatedly stood behind them, full stop. A question for analysts and analysts in training: when we align with the totality of C.G. Jung's thought in an undifferentiated way, do we rationalize or racialize and perpetuate long disproven scientific errors in our practices, in our schools, in our communities, in our homes? Jung left his biases in print even after he was approached by the UN to correct the racist attitude, even after his death. An approach that holds integrity requires that we look within our collective paradigm and within ourselves. Otherwise, we may inadvertently align with an attitude that promotes race theory. Jung has a lot of constructive thoughts on the subject. He does not rule out the possibility of a wider application of the analytic method to groups. This would require teachers who are sure that their own attitudes are in need of change. Jung writes, "A man whose heart is not changed will not change any others." It's evident that a better knowledge of man's psyche begins with a better understanding of oneself. When groups know which of their unconscious tendencies and habits are injurious to others, they feel the moral obligation to do something about it, provided a sense of duty and their love are normally developed in the individuals and sustained by the group. That's again, volume 18, paragraph 1398. So in what ways do we, analysts in training, identify with an attitude that prizes differentiation, but somehow devalues inclusion? If social change begins with the individual, let global change begin with our individualizing paradigm embodied in each analyst who has the constitution to evolve. Our synthetic theory is a conglomeration of gold seeds from around the globe. It's intrinsically ours. As for the term race, it's racist. Let's expire this dysfunctional psychological weapon of terror. We don't need that cornerstone of racism. Biases will still exist, even ethnic biases, but we will have rectified a very tired and hugely bewildered dinosaur. And what keeps racism going? What keeps it systematized? I propose that it is the attitude of white supremacy. This is different from white supremacism, because white supremacism requires conscious choice, a conscious identification with an ideology. I'm talking about something that those who prize themselves for being progressive, for being relatively liberal, for being inclusive and diverse, what role do we have in it? When we over-identify with the archetype white, or with any archetype for that matter, we're at risk of great harm to ourselves and to others. But white supremacy is an over-identification with that archetype, and an over-identification with the attitude of Carl Jung. Next, we'll have a presentation from Tiffany.
Thanks, Chris. I guess we're saving all the questions and discussions for after. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's best.
Okay, great. There's just so much there. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I echo the gratitude for this this really interesting and amazing conglomeration of analysts and friends who have gotten together to dedicate time on a Friday evening to meet and talk and learn together. And I'm very inspired just being amongst you and hearing from Luciana, Marcus, and Isa about your group and your dedication to one another through the pandemic. I find it just something that I long for, actually. So it's exciting to see that this is happening across your very large country. So thank you for inviting us. I'm gonna just give a little bit of a talk today based from the chapter that I contributed to our book. And then afterwards we'll have some time to talk about all of this. So the title of my talk is The Sunken Place: Silence as the Propagation of Toxic Whiteness. In his 2017 film, Get Out, Peele depicts a new form of slave trade, a ritual that takes place at the Kincaid Plantation, a white family in an affluent area outside of a nearby urban metropolis, where annual modern slave auction parties are hosted. Before the weekend's slave trade begins, Rose's mother, Missy, the white psychiatrist in the movie, takes special interest in Rose's new Black boyfriend, Chris, whom she has brought home to visit. Missy calls Chris into her office, reportedly to help him kick the habit of smoking, and proceeds to induce and then program a conditioned automatic state of paralysis in Chris. With a tap on her teacup, she thrusts Chris into the sunken place, a place of immobile liminality, of falling forever. Chris is suspended in nothingness, likened to a conscious state within his unconscious, screaming with no one to hear him. Suspended in his own psyche, unable to voice the scream of protest and revolt, He has been programmed. Later in the movie, Missy will tap the teacup and hand Chris over to her husband, suspended and frozen within. A neurosurgeon, her husband, will remove a portion of Chris's brain, keeping his body alive, to replace it with the cognitive functioning and memory network system of the brain of the highest white bidder, seeking the fountain of youth. The previously white-bodied individual is to be endowed with a longer life and a stronger body. The white person's brain will occupy the Black body, leaving only a small trace of his own psyche behind the eyes of his new inhabitant. Throughout the film, we receive glimpses of the former psyche of the Black subjects whose bodies were abducted and sold when certain brief flickers of light cause a glitch in the inner system. The Black psyche is contacted and momentarily erupts in outrage and fear whilst attempting escape. When contacted, the Black subject screams to Chris, "Get out," only to be thrust quickly back into paralysis by the psychiatrist's mother by the tap of a spoon on a teacup. One can feel the present-day implications of these scenes cloaked within this horror film. In Peele's film, the white subject is portrayed as the one who knows and then uses that knowing to rob the subject of his own volition, threatening to lock the Black subject into a state of liminality and dissociation. Missy's violation of Chris's volition, thrusting him into the sunken place, has dual meaning. This state of paralysis in the sunken place is not only an amplification of the unconscious repetition of the effects of white silence upon the Black subject, but is simultaneously an amplification of the effects of white silence upon the white subject. She thrusts Chris into the sunken place, suspended in liminality, so that she cannot hear his protest. She refuses to be affected by his subjectivity. In doing this, she evacuates her own sense of volition and claims innocence in this action. In a form of reversal, Peele portrays the violence of white silence upon the Black subject while simultaneously amplifying the violence that white silence has upon all subjects. The horror enacted on the Black subject is the result of the white subject's refusal to be penetrated by the protest of the Black subject. Her silencing the reality of the other in front of her, and her refusal to be implicated in her own acts of violence. I suggest this violent act of silencing the other into paralysis, which Peele so aptly portrays in his film, is at play within our very own field of analytical psychology. It shows up in the guise of analytic neutrality. The fact that Peele uses the image of a psychiatrist as the perpetrator speaks to the felt dangerous reality that lives deeply within our own field of work and study, the danger of claiming psychoanalytic innocence or neutrality. I suggest that what Peele amplifies mythologically is the psychic defense against integration within the white-bodied person that comes as a result of white body supremacy trauma. A clinical social worker and trauma therapist, Resmaa Menakem, describes white body supremacy trauma as unhealed racialized trauma that cannot be traced back to a single specific event. In white bodies, it is trauma resultant from inflicting and perpetuating white supremacy in our cultural institutions and collective life in general. Charles Mills describes white supremacy as, quote, the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today, end quote. While white supremacy has shaped Western political and social thought and practices for hundreds of years, it has never been named as such. Its silence renders white supremacy unconscious and invisible unto its perpetrators. White body supremacy trauma is the inherited, unconscious, and unrecognized somatic, familial, and cultural impacts that manifest as dirty pain. Menakem describes dirty pain as avoidance, blame, and denial. When people respond from their most wounded parts, become cruel or violent, or physically or emotionally run away, they also create more of it for themselves, end quote. He suggests if white body supremacy trauma gets transmitted and compounded through multiple families and generations, it can start to look like culture. Jung speaks to this in his articulation of an activated and complex archetype, saying, quote, "But if it is a question of a general incompatibility or an otherwise injurious condition productive of neurosis in relatively large numbers of individuals, then we must assume the presence of constellated archetypes, since neuroses are in most cases not just private concerns, but social phenomena. We must assume that archetypes are constellated in these cases too. The archetype corresponding to the situation is activated, and as a result, those explosive and dangerous forces hidden in the archetype come into action, frequently with unpredictable consequences. There is no lunacy people under the domination of an archetype will not fall prey to." In Jungian theory, we have a method to understand this kind of inherited intergenerational trauma. Jung's There we go. How about now? That was weird. Can you hear me now? How long has it been off? Just a second.
Tiffany, wait a minute. Cláudia, seu
Right. Okay.
microfone fechado. Ok.
Okay. In the Jungian theory, we have a method to understand this kind of inherited intergenerational trauma. Taking Jung's understanding and concepts of both complex theory and collective unconscious, Jungian analysts Thomas Singer and Samuel Kembles put forward the notion of cultural complexes. Building on Joseph Henderson's idea of the cultural unconscious, an interlocutor layer between the collective and the personal unconscious, a cultural complex can be understood to reside within the space between the personal and the collective. Singer and Kembles described how the cultural complex exists within the psyche of the collective as a whole and the individual members of the group, and mostly have to do with trauma, discrimination, feelings of oppression and inferiority at the hands of another offending group, end quote. Putting this Jungian concept of the cultural complex with Resmaa Menakem's work on white body supremacy trauma, we see how culture is mapped out of our personal and collective wounds. These wounds seek to inject a sense of evil and otherness unconsciously experienced within the insider, who represents dominant culture, into the outsider, the other outside of majority culture, outside of hegemonic power structures. Once the evil is extracted out of the insider, the white-bodied person who holds the dominant cultural power, and injected into the outsider, the black-bodied person, the insider seeks to paralyze and silence the other, the outsider, to resist a feeling of implication. It is exactly this feeling of implication that would open space for integration. Silence is a defense of the ego complex against the rising tide of affect that has been built up through years of collective and cultural suppression. I see silence as the gatekeeper of emotion. Dirty pain thwarts a working through of the intergenerational trauma of white body supremacy. As psychoanalyst Hannah Zevin says, quote, "Neutrality is also protective. It confers the power on psychoanalysis to sit outside time, place, politics, and history." Much of our work as analysts falls within the phenomena of bearing witness. We stand witness to the vicissitudes of our patients' experiences, past and present, as well as their fantasies, the early childhood trauma that was survived and is now being related to, the horrific experience of personal and social wounding, the debilitating depressions and psychotic episodes, the joy, the laughter, the slow growth of consciousness that inches its way around and around, backward and forward, toing and froing from the center to the periphery. It is, of course, easier to bear witness to that which we have had some exposure. It comes more naturally to witness and affirm the aspects of the patient's self that penetrate the rigidity of their conscious ego when those images, motifs, and dynamics of self follow a trajectory that is more familiar to the analyst. However, when confronted with images that are unfamiliar or are perhaps threatening, statements or feelings that arise from the patient that challenge our own ways of knowing and being, it is all too common to allow the unfamiliarity to go unacknowledged. When unacknowledged feeling states or images emerge but are not related to by the analyst, they remain in unconscious suspension. We may speak of this suspension as a type of paralysis that puts unacknowledged feelings at risk of erasure. Comments that may prick something within us analysts that we cannot understand, or that we feel ashamed of, fall by the wayside and are not picked up for play, for discussion, or for relating. I often hear Jungian analysts uphold the concept of analytic abstinence. This is an analytic stance that claims neutrality on the side of the analyst, born out of one's own process of individuation through one's own long-term personal analysis. It is taught that the role of the analyst is to remain neutral, free of judgment, engaging with the symbols that arise in the psychic process of the patient without an agenda, not to proselytize, convert, exhort, judge, or correct the analysand's behavior from one's own personal stance. This is, in one major way, what often distinguishes analysis from therapy. The analyst listens to the patient's life story, learning of the earliest encounters with others and self, listening for the patient's own roadmap coming forth from the self, that other that is simultaneously personal and transpersonal. The Jungian analyst also listens symbolically to the movement and the work of psyche within narratives, symptoms, symbols, and relationships of the analysand. This kind of listening and reflecting with the analysand focuses the work on the contents of the unconscious expressed in dreams, enactments, repetitions, and the intersubjective relationship or the transference and countertransference dynamics between analyst and analysand. The training for the analyst is specific and deep and personal. What is required first and foremost is a rigorous ongoing relationship with one's own unconscious process. Second of importance is a wide breadth of knowledge of mythology and different symbol systems that might come up within the unconscious of the patient that might be unfamiliar to the analyst. What is equally important to this second tenet is a working knowledge of diverse cultures and their religious or spiritual systems, worldviews, and mythological tropes. Jung himself placed a high value on traveling the world and immersing himself in a variety of cultures, studying their religious systems, their cultural rituals and customs, and their symbolic objects. However, Jung's exploration of the other external was in service of his own other internal and a byproduct of the white imaginary. His inquiry had an unfortunate result of appropriation. He was searching the world over far and wide to find a symbol system that would help him map out his unique view of psyche and psychic process and transformation. In addition, he was taking his own method and looking for ways in which cultures affirmed the relevance of his method. From Gnosticism in the texts of the ancient Near East, to typology gleaned from the European philosophers, poets, and writers, to the ancient Chinese Taoist texts, The Secret of the Golden Flower, and then finally to his work with the late medieval tradition of alchemy. Jung was looking for a symbol system that reflected what he experienced as psychic process, both within himself and within the patients, nearly all white Europeans, with whom he worked and eventually birthed the unique branch of psychoanalysis that became known as analytical psychology. It was through his engagement in experiential research in other cultures and with a plethora of diverse texts that he penned the concept of the collective unconscious. The uniqueness, and I would argue, relevance of Jungian psychology lies within Jung's notion that psyche and psychological process includes the collective in addition to the personal unconscious. For Jung, psychological development within the individual is limited when kept within the frame of the personal unconscious. Whereas in the personal unconscious, we find all those contents that have been forgotten or due to the demands of one's own upbringing and development have been repressed. Within the collective unconscious live all those contents that have not yet been known to consciousness. I believe we can understand white supremacy as a definite form of psychic content that exists in all individuals found in the psychic content of the other. Other, I define as that which is not me. Me is understood here as that which is defined as right, good, acceptable, and normal by dominant culture. That which is not me is that which is not right, not acceptable, out of the bounds of normal, unknown, alien, and foreign. What Jung adds to the rich history of the study of the other in his notion of the self, the other that confronts us within, a transpersonal control point, or self-representations of unconscious developments, that which is in us but bigger than us, beyond the personal, yet confronting us personally, bringing in that which has never been brought in before. Resmaa Menakem puts forth a way of understanding white body supremacy trauma through the lens of trauma theory. He contends, quote, white body supremacy is always functioning in our bodies. It operates in our thinking brains and our assumptions, our expectations, and mental shortcuts. It operates in our muscles and nervous systems where it routinely creates constriction. But it operates most powerfully in our lizard brains. Our lizard brain cannot think. It is reflexively protective and it is strong. It loves what it feels will keep it safe, and it fears and hates whatever it feels will do us harm. I hear this through Jung's understanding of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, what he calls, quote, ancient images restored to life by the primitive and illogical mode of thinking peculiar to dreams. It is not a question of inherited ideas, but of inherited thought patterns. The unconscious contains not only the personal, but also the impersonal collective components in the form of inherited categories or archetypes. So holding Menakem's notion of white body supremacy trauma with Jung's notion of the collective unconscious as inherited thought patterns, I'm going to now turn to the concept of the implicated subject proffered by philosopher Michael Rothberg. Together, these three concepts begin to speak to the silence or dirty pain that has been historically perpetuated within white dominant spaces and culture. Briefly before turning to Rothberg, I will bring this conversation more intimately into the world of Jungian analysis and more largely psychoanalytic learning and training communities. Donald Moss, a faculty and psychoanalyst within the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, contends in his article on having whiteness that whiteness, quote, opportunistically attaches to any psychic structure that maps self and object vertically. These vertical planes are ubiquitous and as such provide an abundance of potential host receptors for parasitic whiteness. He describes the vertical planes along 6 different lines, each of which delineate inner and outer or insider and outsider within the good, with the good being inside and the bad being outside. Now, the publication of Moss's article resulted in him receiving numerous death threats from the alt-right. This was published in 2019. From his psychoanalytic colleagues and the liberal left, he was written off as writing about a topic that simply did not have a place within the psychoanalytic field. In her recent article, Unfree Association, in 2022, his stepdaughter, Hannah Zevin, writes that Moss was seen as a discipline traitor. The psychoanalytic community felt him to be making race and racism a central node of psyche. She relates, quote, he got into trouble with his peers, not for how he addressed whiteness per se, but for violating the white analytic tradition of not addressing it at all. Since June 2020, businesses, institutes of higher education, and organizations of all kinds have been asked to deeply examine every aspect of their practices for the ways in which they have been implicitly aligned with white supremacy and their business practices. When bringing this issue into the psychoanalytic space, it is immediately met with either caution or suspicion. The Guild states that this kind of work belongs not in the psychoanalytic space where we attempt to achieve neutrality. The work, meaning consciousness around the ways in which whiteness or white body supremacy trauma infect and affect each and every person, as the argument goes, is not necessarily relevant when it comes to the analytic ethic or the analytic dyad. If we are under the ethic of neutrality, our job as analysts is not to bring our political, social, or religious views into the analytic container. However, I contend that the trauma of white supremacy on all bodies is neither a political nor a social platform. White supremacy trauma lives in the collective unconscious. It is archetypal in nature, and we know of its impact through the body. This condition described by Moss is foundational. It generates characteristic ways of being in one's body, in one's mind, and in the world. Parasitic whiteness renders its host's appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. With this definition in mind, we return to the fictional image of Missy thrusting Chris into the sunken place, and the image of the silent but voraciously hungry white bitters vying for Chris's body, all while purporting to be good white Obama voting liberals. Effective treatment consists of a combination of psychic and social historical interventions, argues Moss. In concert with Moss, I argue the mutative agent that allows for effective treatment here is found in the feeling function and in the body. What neutrality allows for is the primacy of the experience of the other with whom we work. However, neutrality has also a protective function. It allows for the analyst to remain on the outside, not to be taken in or down by the patient's suffering or experiences. Another outcome of neutrality, I argue, is a defense against the intimacy that the horror of the other brings and evokes within ourselves, silencing the felt impact of one's own implication. In After the Catastrophe, written just after World War I, on the cusp of World War II, Jung writes, since no man lives within his own psychic sphere like a snail in his shell, separated from everybody else, but is contacted with his fellow men by his unconscious humanity, no crime can ever be what it appears to be to our consciousness, an isolated psychic happening. In this article, he relates collective guilt to a state of magical uncleanliness. He expands further. It is a fact that cannot be denied. The wickedness of others becomes our own wickedness because it kindles something evil in our hearts. The murder has been suffered by everyone, and everyone has committed it. Lured by the irresistible fascination of evil, we have all made this collective psychic murder possible, and the closer we were to it, the better we could see, the greater our guilt. In this way, we are unavoidably drawn into the uncleanness of evil, no matter what our conscious attitude may be. Jung is describing what Michael Rothberg articulates as the implicated subject. In Rothberg's articulation, building on Hannah Arendt's work around collective responsibility, he proposes to move beyond the binary of victim and perpetrator to offer a third way. In the binary of victim and perpetrator, one can find a way to silence the feelings that arise from owning one's own participation in collective harm. While one may not be complicit in evil done to others, meaning the direct perpetrators of harm, one may be implicitly involved. Knowing about horrors and remaining silent in the face of them implicates one in the perpetuation of harm. Rothberg defines implicated subjects as those who occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm. They contribute to, inherit, or benefit from regimes of domination, but do not originate or control such regimes. An implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather a participant in histories and social formations that generate the positions of victim and perpetrator, and yet in which most people do not occupy such clear-cut roles. Implicated subjects help propagate the legacies of historical violence and prop up the structures of inequality that mar the present. Individuation is the process of establishing a robust and vital relationship between the ego and the self, or between consciousness and unconscious contents and process. I suggest a crucial aspect of the analytic work is to become conscious of how white body supremacy trauma silences and pushes the effects and affects upon all bodies further into the unconscious. A way for white analysts and majority white training institutes to begin bringing consciousness to the real aspect of our collective is by feeling into, rather than thinking about, our own implicated subjectivity on a personal level. For thinking about and creating theories that help us understand cognitively allows us to stay on the outside of the horror. Feeling into it penetrates us right at the core, bringing us into the center of the horror. How do white clinicians hear and address the racial complex when it comes into treatment? And what about when it enters as a derivative, indirectly? This ultimately depends upon our analysts' capacity to hear and a certain ego strength to allow for the penetration of what has before been frozen, paralyzed, and eradicated from consciousness. Rothberg states, quote, implication emerges from the ongoing, uneven, and destabilizing intrusion of irrevocable pasts into the unredeemed present. We cannot hear if we are not aware of it first in ourselves. We become aware by feeling the effects of our own implication.
Thank you,
Obrigada,
Tiffany.
gente. Obrigada, Christopher. Obrigada, Tiffany. Nossa, que tema importante e indigesto, né? A gente vai ouvindo, vai dando... Enfim, é isso aí. Vamos enfrentar o tema. E aí a gente começa o debate. Quem tiver pergunta, por favor, coloca o nome do chat que eu vou chamar. Eu tenho duas perguntas para começar a fazer. Eu vou começar com a primeira, que eu vou tentar colocar em palavras isso tudo que me veio aqui para juntar. Eu queria fazer para os dois, eu queria que os dois comentassem. Bom, o Christopher falou que a atitude da supremacia branca é o que faz se perpetuar o preconceito, né? Então, partindo disso, e de uma outra afirmação do Jung, que ele fala que a mudança de atitude começa com os indivíduos, ele fala, né, uma espécie de mana, de contaminação, que um vai contaminando o outro, tal. Ele fala isso em alguns lugares, né? E pensando na atitude preconceituosa dele, né? E aí, usando a neutralidade que a Tiffany traz na palestra dela, eu fico pensando que o Jung... É muito difícil falar isso, né? Mas eu fico pensando que o Jung fez um desserviço nesse sentido da clínica dele. Porque se ele pensa nessa contaminação dos indivíduos, né? E se ele tinha essas atitudes preconceituosas, é impossível que isso não tenha passado na clínica dele. Esse é meu primeiro comentário. E tem mais uma coisa que eu pensei, né? Porque ele fala dessa coisa do indivíduo, né? Da contaminação, que é muito diferente do que o Hillman fala, né? O Hillman fala que não que a mudança não acontece assim no 1 a 1. O Hillman fala que a mudança acontece na política, tem que ir para as ruas, né? Então acho que isso também é uma diferença que eu queria que vocês comentassem.
Wow. Okay, thank you. I don't know, Tiffany, you want to take a stab first, or?
Sure, if you want. I appreciate those questions. First of all, did Jung do us a disservice with this concept of neutrality? And you know, this is a larger psychoanalytic. This was like the Freudian, you know, Freud didn't even want to be looked at, right? So that's why he used the couch. So I think not to just like hang this on Jung, because Jung, I think, was actually going for something quite different. When I go into Jung's house, and I did the tour while I was in Küsnacht over the summer. And I was so struck by how non-neutral his work must have been. You know, you walk into his house, you go up and you see his kids playing in the garden, or playing piano at the table. You go into his office. First, you walk through his library where you see all his collection. And then you go into his office where his red book is there and his stained glass windows. And so the idea of analytic neutrality, I don't know that I really read that in Jung proper. I think it's a Jungian or an analytic conversation that has been, in an essence, to sort of, I do think, to protect the patient, that we don't bring our own or pollute the field or the space with our unprocessed material, right? So this is a kind of way of talking about how we, why we have our own lifelong analysis ourselves. So we don't bring too much. So we don't unconsciously put stuff into the field that isn't brought by the analysand. But of course, that's impossible, because our bodies carry with us the smells that we were cooking in the kitchen, or my face gets red, I've been told by many people, like in ways it's not even necessarily like a complex reaction. I just like get flushed. Like sometimes I have, and so it's like, but that's like my history. I think it has to do with my ethnic belonging, and so these ways betray us when we're in relationship with our patients. So I think, like, I guess, yeah, in some ways, what my feeling is, can I, as analyst, have that kind of ego suppleness enough to say, okay, the kind of analytic neutrality, which is, my patient, I'm not going to give away my feeling about a certain thing. This right now, where we're in the world with, the uproar happening in Gaza, and every one of my patients is coming in across the board and looking at me, wanting to sort of sniff out, can they tell where I stand? And some of them, they know I'm here, or they know I'm there, but the capacity to kind of hold that space and allow for it to all come in is one thing. But then when there's something that's not being addressed, but is in the room, right? And perhaps it's not being addressed because there's an assumption about where I might land on something, and they feel they can't talk about it because they just know that I must be here and I might be in the position of power. Then I think it is my job in that moment to maybe break what we might call analytic neutrality and name the thing that can't be named. Not to give not to show a kind of side, but to bring the difficult topic directly into the room. So, and I think that's what Jung's method actually allows for, because it says we meet each other face to face, and and so our face betrays us. And so it offers, I think, the capacity, if the analysand feels they can say, I see something going on, then, and can I be solid enough to say, yeah, this thing is going on, let me go there and check that out, right? That opens up more room for the analysand to feel like they can take more risks, and that all of them can come into the container. Okay, I'll stop because I just said a lot. Chris?
Well, now I'm thinking.
Deixa eu
Yeah,
só
yes.
falar uma coisinha. Eu concordo plenamente. Eu não acho que o Jung era neutro na clínica dele. E o desserviço que eu comentei é com relação ao preconceito dele sendo perpetuado na clínica, justamente pela não neutralidade. Pelo que o Christopher falou, né? Disso que a atitude da supremacia branca faz o preconceito perpetuar. Entende?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I
Desculpa.
mean, you can see a lack of neutrality right there, because he knew he
Right.
was a pioneer. He knew he was celebrated. There was no getting away from that. He knew he stumbled upon something that had not been verbalized the way he was able to verbalize it. The link between us across borders, across gender identifications, across traditions, there's something that links us, that in our humanity. But he pushed the stuff out. It's in writing. He knew it was in writing. He knew people would look. People were clinging to his word back then. They're clinging to his word now. So I do see it as propaganda. I can't. As far as neutrality in his practice, the word neutrality doesn't even come to mind for me. I think he really appreciated the intersubjectivity, that one and one were in the room and a third was going to come out. So I'm not sure what to do with that, but clearly he put his stuff in writing for posterity. It's going to last in writing. That's why you put your theory in writing. And he was concerned about the global situation of humanity. And for him, the shadow, the collective psyche, and what the collective was not aware of or not willing to address and correct. He had is reticent about those things. So when he comes out and makes statements about the collective, that's I see it as kind of bold for Jung. You would expect pushback from people who don't actually understand psychoanalysis or why he comes up with these ideas. He seems like he really believed in them, and that's the sticking point, because today people are saying, well, he was really brilliant, and I couldn't come up with what he came up with, so who am I to question him? So you end up just saying, okay, let me table it. But to table it doesn't mean you're not still digesting it, right? We are what we eat.
And then it comes out in our pores. If we think about it that way, right? That idea, I think, Luciano, what you're saying is the unsaid is, of course, the unspoken, right? That is not neutral, right? And so that is a manifestation of where we come from and what we don't know about. What I loved your question about change, the difference between Jung and Hillman on this issue of contamination, and Hillman saying change doesn't happen in the individual, it happens in the polis. And I think, I love what Hillman says when a couple comes into the room, and how to work with it, where it's not just, if a marriage is like on the rocks or having trouble, to look outside and say, well, what's going on in our collective right now? And how is this marriage or this couple embodying the I'm going to call it the lack in the collective, right? The problem of the collective lands in the individual as fault. And I think what Jung's method has the possibility for is this in fact this inevitability of contamination that is our work actually to I thought about this a lot during COVID, because we're all, you know, we need to go behind closed doors, and we can't infect one another, and how we work with that psychically is, you know, my feeling was always like, but if we aren't infected, we don't change, right? We don't actually get well. And so I think he has that in psychology, the transference, like the infection of the analyzon into the analyst. But for some reason, in this particular way, he remained uninfected, I think. I don't know, Chris, if that resonates with you.
Yeah, you know, I there's more history on Jung for me to read about, like the many biographies that are out there. But the image I'm getting of Jung was that he was pretty strong-willed, and he was pretty authoritative. That's the image I'm getting, and that's not really that's a position of knowing. And if you read the visions and you read a number of his writings, it comes through. It's almost like verbal slapping those who were in conference with him sometimes. So there's I see this hubris. I see it as a real danger. If you identify with the hero archetype, if you identify with any archetype, I think even the concept of archetype needs to be revisited and expanded. I kind of like what Hillman does with it, but I don't want to totally abandon what Jung does. But Hillman seems to open it up a little more. Neutrality, again, I don't think it was a thing for Jung. I can't quite answer the second question because I'm not so familiar with Hillman, to tell the truth.
Ótimo. Obrigada, gente. Eu tenho mais uma pergunta, mas eu vou passar para o Marcos agora, fazer a dele. Microfone desligado.
Oi, Christopher, Tiffany. Bom, várias questões aqui que vocês me levantaram, mas a palavra que me veio ao ouvir vocês é que tem uma atitude muito corajosa. Acho que a palavra é essa, coragem, de ambos em tocarem em temas que são muito delicados dentro da comunidade junguiana. E eu admiro esse espírito corajoso e estou querendo um pouco entrar nisso. Eu tenho duas perguntas, né? Uma para o Christopher, outra para a Tiffany. Tiffany, vou fazer primeiro para você. Vamos lá. A supremacia branca é um trauma e a supremacia branca é um trauma, e dar-se conta da existência dela como um trauma, como realidade psíquica, não é uma plataforma política. Acho isso absolutamente fundamental, né? Reconhecer a supremacia branca como uma realidade psíquica oriunda de um trauma não faz do analista que reconhece isso um militante ou uma plataforma política. Isso é uma realidade também social e cultural. Nesse sentido, eu te pergunto, o racismo é interpretável? O racismo pode ser alvo de uma interpretação psicológica? Ou seja, aquele analista que está preso nos ideais de neutralidade, nos ideais de abstinência, esse analista é capaz de escutar uma cena, ver uma imagem, ouvir um relato de um paciente trazendo uma questão sobre o racismo, e é possível ele escutar essa imagem de um outro lugar? Ou seja, a gente interpreta o racismo? Ou o racismo é uma realidade que deve ser, entre aspas, denunciada, combatida, falada, dita? A minha pergunta talvez possa estar um pouco confusa. Se nós tomarmos o racismo como algo que não é interpretável, nós somos analistas que estamos, como vocês dizem nos Estados Unidos, somos analistas que estamos dentro do movimento woke. Nós poderíamos ser acusados de analistas junguianos woke ou não? Não sei se fica claro, Tiffany, mas queria um pouco deixar essa questão.
Yeah.
Vamos
Okay.
lá, depois eu faço para o Christopher.
Okay. So I'm going to try and make sure I'm understanding the question. It's because it's got a lot of layers. So this concept of being woke is really, it really shuts down. I'm sure you've noticed. I'm wondering if that's where the question is coming out of, because I since writing this chapter and editing this book with Christopher, that is definitely some feedback that I have gotten from colleagues about, oh, you're just too woke. And I feel,
Tiffany,
yeah.
feedback ou crítica?
Not credit, not in a positive way. I'll say that. Because I think this is really, really tricky stuff, because this is really old, and I don't know the history of Brazil well enough to speak about this, but certainly in the history of the United States, I think this is our founding trauma. And what Resmaa Menakem talks about actually is that the colonizers came with their own trauma. And so this white body supremacy trauma is reenacting trauma all of the time. And I think it's happening in analysis. And this is not, and so okay, so then your question was, can you interpret, I think you're asking this, can you interpret an exchange or an interaction? I'm not sure if you mean, can you say, okay, there are a couple of ways to think about this. And I give a clinical example in my paper, which I'm not proud of. This is not a great example. And but this is like one of the things that I think is really tricky. It's how do we address this, what for me, white woman in America, is a profoundly activating complex. And so how I work with that with patients, with my patients of color, is very different than how I work with that with my my patients who are white. But it doesn't. And so in this idea of interpretation and translation, all of that comes into account. And also registering my own affect about what is coming in. So there's never a time, and I don't think you're saying this, but I just want to, I guess there's never a time when I would say, oh, that's your racism. I don't think that's what you're asking. I'm not sure. That is what you're asking.
É nessa direção, sim.
Okay. I think that's going to get us nowhere to say that, right? I think to start to talk about it, bring more consciousness into the context. So I wonder where you originally learned about that story. So if someone's coming in and they're like, and there's a kind of really activating exchange that they've had, if I'm with a white patient and they're talking about a very activating exchange with a Black friend, and then they have all these layers in there, right? Then I'm going to start to wonder with them, like, okay, where where did you learn this messaging from? Where do you feel it in your body? I'm going to get them to drop in, because there often is like an unbearable pain, shame, panic attack, like that has come up, so like if we go there and try to do some work around that, that is a way of helping subjectivize, meaning bring back the subjectivity to the one in the room who I think has silenced their own complicated trauma around that experience of being, what Rothberg says, implicated for years in that way. Does that make sense? It's not a call out. That is not, in my view, my experience, analytic or anything like that, right? It's a delicate, and it's a feeling in my own body. And it's a wondering and helping the patient bring their body into the room. It feels like that. Does that answer your question?
Sim.
Christopher, quer falar algo sobre isso?
As the 5th African-American analyst, I have the privilege of having patients of various ethnicities coming in with a general malaise, a low feeling. It's, as Tiffany said, people are coming in with reverberations from the collective, and they seem unanimously to be confused and why they're feeling low. And so when we follow the feeling, which is what I do, we get to the image of this war and the images of apocalypse. Americans with our quality of Christianity, we're either looking for it, we're looking to create it, or we're looking to avoid it. But the apocalypse is on our minds quite often. And there is a racialized dynamic to the war. Can't even talk about it, because to say anything sounds to take a side. To take a side seems to end the conversation. But here in the analysis, they have a safe space, and still it's hard for them to feel safe to verbalize it. So I find myself saying, have you been thinking about the war? And then it's finally, oh, yeah, I can't sleep. I can't. This can open up to following the trail of feeling can lead to even clarity of thoughts of those who should have and those who shouldn't have. When we talk about race, we say race in Europe, that seems to be the quality in the meaning of race. Those who have and those who want the resource and are trying to get it. The consumer versus the provider. Capitalism. But in America, it really is about a kind of species of being. And so when I have a white patient, sometimes that comes through. And when it comes through, I don't mind looking at the transference right there. But we can follow psyche for the most part, because it is autonomous. It does want to compensate. It does seems to be seeking wellness. You can follow the trail of psyche and even get to the barriers, because I don't see race in psyche. I see race in ego unconsciousness, not the deeper parts of psyche, of soul and spirit. So then it becomes, well, here's the image of what you're living with in wake life, and here's what something deep inside of you is calling for. Psyche can bridge, but the ego we do what we're supposed to do. We're guiding our lives. We're on top of the horse. but we have attitudes. Personas have attitudes aligned with them. Personalities are expressions of attitudes. And we get locked on it until we learn that sometimes being unsafe is the road to healing. Sometimes breaking is the road to mending. So I don't, like Tiffany, I don't necessarily go looking to pull it out. In psyche, you can quite often make a mark of it in a dream with color imagery. It'll be color imagery, but to the ego, it may be race. They can have that conversation. Yeah. On neutrality, again, it seems to be a complaint of enough American psychoanalysts that they don't quite know how to get into the conversation. And really, it's not the job of getting into the conversation. That'd be bringing our agenda to the patient. But we got to do our work still. The work doesn't end. Individuation's a life process. It's not like, oh, here's another issue I have to address. Yeah, that's called change management. Manage that change, because we're going to go from putrefaction to embodiment, back to putrefaction to embodiment, and hopefully we'll be growing stronger and stronger all along. But something about race, it's about self-preservation. It's about preservation of a specific collective. It's about preservation of whiteness. You know, hey, the colonists put in a lot of work, man. They put in a lot of work. They lost some soldiers. You know, they lost some battles too. Hey, they got the gold. And now they got beautiful cities with beautiful palaces that we say are primary pillars of history. I'm not impressed when I see a castle. I just am not. So anyways, that's me. What do you say, Marcus?
Christopher, deixa eu fazer só mais uma pergunta. Por que você acha que esse tema, supremacia branca e racismo, ficou tantos e tantos anos fora da pauta junguiana, da discussão junguiana? Por que esse tema ficou tão à margem? E, ao mesmo tempo, o que permitiu que esse tema agora viesse à tona? Quais são as condições atuais que permitiram, por exemplo, que um livro como o teu e da Tiffany fosse publicado? Que vocês viessem no teatro falar disso? O que aconteceu? Você tem uma teoria sobre isso?
Yeah, I hope that my quick response doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about your question deeply, because it's something I've been thinking about before I entered analytic training. I thought about it in high school. I thought about it in college. I thought about it when I wasn't in school, just living my life. Because as a Black man, racism approaches you. You don't go looking for it. Right? So what is it about the moment? The moment is this particular Black man who got a little closer, learned a little more, because I knew some of the theory before I started my training. But the more I learned, the more I realized that, yeah, it might be part of his unus mundus, but not really. This really angered me, because I came into training with a bit of idealization of Jung. I didn't worship him. He was not the second Christ to me. But I kind of idealized the pioneers, you know, to have the brilliant thought. I really kind of idolize that. And when I read it, it just makes me livid. So why now is particularly because I had the opportunity to say something, but there are those who wrote before me who've been writing for years. And there are those who are non-Jungians who've been writing for decades. We just don't pay attention to it because it doesn't matter to us, because it's not necessarily my backyard, because I don't necessarily even have patients who that's an issue for me, because I'm living the good life. I'm living right. I'm living a Christian life. I'm not killing anybody. I'm trying to be inclusive. I can't save every battle. It's not my issue. It's not me. That keeps it going too. Why now is just because I had the opportunity, but there were people before me, and there are going to be more writing as well.
Ótimo.
Alguma
Obrigado.
coisa, Tiffany?
No, I think I just, as I was listening to you, Chris, I was thinking about this. I wonder what this is a product of, the feeling of I've done, you know, I'm not on social media, but of course most of my patients are, and I hear all the time this phrase, I've done the work. They're doing the work. You know, she's not doing the work. It's like, what is that? I'm like, what does that mean? But then I think that there's what I'm hearing is it's like, there's something, and I don't know what it's a product of. Like I could say, you know, heteropatriarchy. I'm not sure that says there's I know how to talk about this. I've done that. So if someone else is saying something inside of gets pricked, some kind of fragility that I'm curious. I don't know what it is, but it's like, well, yeah, let's all talk about it. There's no one and done, or we were there, we already did that, now let's move on. It's like, well, how is it coming now, and how do we continue the conversation? And it's not, you know, because Christopher and I edited this book as if nothing has come before or nothing will come again, or institutes haven't been doing some work around this. There are institutes who have been doing work. That's great, and we want to join the party and like have more deeper conversation and just continue it. But I do notice there seems to be something that gets activated around, we are, you know, like, don't say we haven't done that. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I've noticed that.
Yeah, that goes along with the pushback against, like, you don't mention woke, right? You never mention woke once in your chapter. I don't think I've ever heard you say woke unless someone asked you about woke. It's a desire to categorize you, put you in a box, and this is racializing. It says you're with that camp. Right? Oh, that heat that she's coming with. It's kind of it's kind of indicting me here. Oh, but I understand why she's coming with. Let me contextualize it. She's got this agenda. I've been told that I'm being too loud because I'm trying to get a seat at the table. Let me tell you, back at Princeton, when I was at Princeton from seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, from 1988 until 1992, I met a number of really, really brilliant people of African American or Latino descent or Hispanic. And there are several African Americans who, with me, came up with this idea. We didn't call it attitude of white supremacy, but it's exactly what we were talking about. It's not new to African America. And it's been said in different ways. But you know what? It becomes color. Racism becomes the problem of the oppressed. And when you speak up, it's like, why aren't you taking me into consideration? I'm not feeling good. As one white analyst complained, why Blacks must have a weaker ego because look what they're doing to us. They're protesting and they're getting loud and they're not thinking about how that makes us feel. And when I argued, well, wouldn't it be a sign of a stronger ego to stand up in front of the collective and to take a risk and speak your point of view? But we get very insular, and we have that privilege of being able to do that and still do good for enough people. But our paradigm, what we're teaching new analysts in training, and for those who read this stuff, they're not stupid. You can read and get enough from Jung without going to an institute. That pushes them further from us. We're closing the door. We're becoming the dinosaurs. We're not getting fresh nutrients in our bones. So our bones are becoming brittle. We're becoming reified and rigidified. At least we're at a great risk of that. The threat is that we will undo, we will displace. It's a real threat that has merit. In New York City, I'm not sure what the number is now, but it's probably over 10,000 migrants have come up into the city. There's virtually no available housing. They have to create more housing here. And people are feeling displaced. People who have worked hard to make their children comfortable, to make their neighborhood safe, are now feeling like, I don't have as much control over that. Some of that is just fear of the unknown and the other, fear of the person who doesn't have the economic sustenance to pay for an expensive apartment. They're in the street with their families. And it's worse if you're a single male, then you're really the criminal. So I don't know. There's a lot for us to think about. But we're going to have to start thinking about it because America is becoming more diverse, and we're there to assist. We're there to help. Not just America, though, is it? What's it like in Brazil? Marcus. What's it like in Brazil?
Especificamente sobre o quê, Christopher?
Well, how are the training institutes discussing, if at all, systemic racism? What's the point of view from your perspective?
Bom, temos amigos aqui dos institutos.
A
Lili,
Lili tá aí?
quer falar algo?
Eu quero, tá?
Claro, à vontade, querida.
Eu estava aqui pensando, né, que
Se
hoje de
apresenta um
manhã...
pouco, Lili, se apresenta um pouco
Tá
para
certo.
eles.
Oi, Christopher, oi, Tiffany. Eu sou a Carmen Lívia. Estudo bastante complexos culturais e sou muito apaixonada por esse tema da supremacia branca, né? E hoje de manhã, a gente teve uma defesa de monografia, né, do Pitágoras, no Instituto de São Paulo, que é um analista preto, e ele estava dizendo sobre... Ele
tá aqui,
estudou
inclusive.
o racismo estrutural e as implicações disso na contratransferência e na transferência. E eu estava pensando, e as entrevistas que ele fez entrevistas em atendimento interraciais, né? De analistas pretos com pacientes brancos e vice-versa. E me fez pensar um pouco na diferença do racismo estrutural para o racismo moral, né? Como ambas as coisas interferem, né, no atendimento. Porque uma das analistas entrevistadas brancas, né, em algum momento, muito tendo em vista o racismo moral, né? Acho que ela acaba sendo pega ali pelo racismo estrutural, né? Porque era uma paciente negra que causava muita chateação nela, né? Ela ficava muito entediada em atender. E ela se vê com muita dificuldade de devolver isso para a paciente, porque ela era uma analista branca e a paciente uma paciente negra, e ela se vê como eu posso produzir nela, né, um abandono, né, algo ruim outra vez, né, e como isso acaba complicando a análise, né. Isso me fez pensar que isso é o racismo atuando também, né, e a dificuldade que a gente acha, né, nessas pequenas filigranas do atendimento, né, assim, quando o racismo está no setting e a gente não fica consciente dos estereótipos envolvidos, né, então queria ouvir vocês a respeito disso, né.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I would love to hear the talk that you heard this morning. I mean, that sounds like that's what I want. I feel like that's what we want to be.
Não estou te ouvindo, Tiffany.
Sorry. Oh, can you hear me or no? Yes.
Sim,
Yeah.
sim.
The difference, what you're naming the difference between structural and moral racism. Is that how you say it? Yeah. And this, where we get caught in, like, and okay, like how I think of it like how we phrase questions or how we speak, the fear of what I'm hearing the white analyst of causing greater harm, not knowing about what that is. Is that how I'm hearing the question? Am I understanding the question correctly?
Tá com o microfone desligado, Lili.
Se eu entendi a pergunta, né? A diferença
Ela
entre o
entendeu.
racismo moral e estrutural.
Yeah.
É isso?
Right. Right. And I think that's sort of the thought around white body supremacy trauma. I think silences the curiosity, the capacity to not know, the willingness to be taken down into really kind of murky, yeah, I am implicated there and I don't know what to do. And I actually think that's exactly, or I think, and Christopher, I'd love to hear you. I'd love to hear some other people's thoughts too about this. Like that my feeling is that allows for the vulnerability and the intimacy and the exchange that can open something up. I don't know how am I causing harm here?
Yeah, I structural racism versus moral racism. I'm not sure that there is in my point of view, I don't see the contrast. I think that structural racism is unethical.
É que às vezes, né, me dá a impressão que a pessoa confunde que ser racista ou não é uma questão de ser uma pessoa boa ou uma moralmente boa ou não. E na verdade é muito mais que isso, né? Assim, tá muito impregnado estruturalmente.
Right.
Então, em nome de ser uma pessoa boa e não causar mais dor no outro, a pessoa não percebe que ela está se vendo superior ao outro, né? O que também é racista.
Obrigada, Lili. Tem uma perguntinha que eu queria chamar, que é a do Bruno Santana. Você não quer fazer, Bruno? Você escreveu no chat?
Pode ser, eu posso fazer a pergunta.
Isso, boa.
A minha pergunta é para o Christopher, porque veio a calhar que eu estou pesquisando sobre isso também, e eu estou lendo a Franny Brewster, que ela vai falar sobre o complexo racial.
Bruno, se apresenta um pouco para a gente, de onde você está falando, só para a gente localizar você um pouquinho.
Beleza, eu sou o Bruno Santana, eu trabalho como arte-terapeuta e minha orientação clínica é junguiana, apesar de não ser psicólogo de formação, e eu estou, no momento, escrevendo um artigo sobre a abordagem da fotografia dentro de um setting arte-terapêutico, e eu estou fazendo esse recorte racial a partir de algumas visões. Voltando, a Fanny Brewster, ela fala, inclusive ela pegando o mesmo trecho, né, que o Christopher trouxe, onde o Jung fala dessa ideia de infecção racial e taranã, e ela coloca esse questionamento a partir da visão dos Estados Unidos, que a quantidade de pessoas negras e pardas é bem menor do que a quantidade de pessoas brancas. E ela faz esse levantamento, ela coloca assim, que o que aconteceria se a quantidade de pessoas negras e pardas fosse maior e como que esse complexo iria se comportar. Faço essa pergunta porque para nós aqui no Brasil é uma realidade. A gente tem 56% de pessoas negras e pardas em relação a pessoas brancas. Então, acho que é preciso fazer essa leitura e eu gostaria de saber da visão de vocês que escreveram o livro, como que vocês acham que isso atuaria dentro dessa perspectiva de quantidades, até, né, por isso que se tem esse racismo estrutural que é totalmente imoral, né? Obrigado.
I like this question. It's a pleasure to meet you, Brother Santana. And thank you for doing art therapy. I could probably use some right now. No offense, not right now, I mean, just in general. All right, let's see, get my head around your question here. I think that there is, we have a difference in how we approach the idea in your question. You know, he said, to read the quote, certain people deserve that you should not kill them. You're indulging your own autoerotic pleasure, warming yourself by the thought of your wonderful kindness, but you're wronging those people. You're leading them to more error. So you need to, okay. Those Negroes are murderous devils who might kill other people as well as yourself. So why should they be free? That's not the quote. That's not the quote. All right. So it's about population. He was saying if this blackness, if this primitiveness really grows, then the American civilization would really be doomed, right? Historically, that is called not just a race question, but it's like, what do you do with these blacks that we freed? What's the deal? What do we do with them? They're a problem. There's a flaw in his statement, because if he's recognizing that we all have a body, we all have a soul, we all have a spirit, if he's recognizing the autonomy of the unconscious, of psyche, and that a win for the psyche is a blow to the ego, so they can have radically different perspectives. And yet he says, on the idea of psychic infection, that it's based on what? These primitive people, right? If we feel his question to really be a serious scientific question, we've already drank the Kool-Aid. You see, we've already bought into the idea that there's an extra kind of primitivity in people of color. I don't think there's evidence for that. So I think there's a flaw in that perspective. Whether or not there's a real problem because there are more blacks than whites. We have to address cultural shifts and cultural conflicts and issues of tolerance. Like, okay, let's say the country becomes majority black. What's going to happen? I mean, people want to be compensated. People, they want to be recognized and given their due. So things have to shift. Did I answer your question? right? So this is what I mean, not saying you, I don't know, but it's very easy to lift up Jung and what he says and be awed by it, like it's numinous. And then what happens is if we don't we have to risk deconstructing everything he says. And I think he promotes that. You know, I think Jung promotes that we experience, not so much that we theorize, but that we embody these things. So if we do that, then his concept just it's stupid. Ethnic groups have differences. They should be celebrated. Not all of our differences should be celebrated, but the fact that there are differences ethnically, the more I learn about Brazil, the more I'm going to learn about myself. It's weird, but that's going to happen. Shutting the door is not the answer, but buying into giving him that much authority. How do you know anything about Blacks if you're not spending time with them? How do you know anything about the African or the Brazilian if you're not spending much time with them? You're in your safe, neutral country, and you're taking a safe, neutral idea, and that's, let's stay here with us. So I think his context really impacted his theory a bit much. How's that, Bruno?
Eu acho que é uma visão muito fechada em si mesmo, né? Em si mesmada, desconsiderando a pluralidade que tem em outras culturas, né? E partindo dele que foi um cara tão inteligente, mas ao mesmo tempo a gente tem o que é inevitável, né? O lado sombrio que ele mesmo coloca. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Bruno. Eu queria pegar carona nessa pergunta do Bruno e falar da mestiçagem. Eu estou me debruçando sobre esse tema por causa de um trabalho que eu estou fazendo. Eu tenho lido muita coisa sobre isso, né? E me parece muito mais complexo do que eu comecei a estudar a princípio. E não é só no Brasil, é no mundo. Mas no Brasil, né, nós somos uma maioria de mestiços, né, Bruno? Mais mestiços do que pretos, na verdade. E a gente não sabe exatamente a quantidade de mestiços porque não tem uma contagem formal, né? O IBGE fala, mesmo aqui no Brasil, que somos muitos mestiços, são divididos entre pretos e brancos, ou indígenas, enfim. E existe uma discussão imensa sobre isso, né? Do ponto de vista dos pretos, que eles têm medo, por conta da mestiçagem, né, eles têm medo de perder o movimento identitário dos grupos étnicos, né, essa importância da cultura, por conta dos brancos, que têm vou usar a palavra necessidade, de um embranquecimento da sociedade, né, e os mestiços que ficam numa espécie de limbo de pertencimento, né? E eu queria saber um pouco se vocês acham que a teoria junguiana pode ser um bom continente para a gente pensar a mestiçagem, e em que lugar? Né? Qual que é a opinião de vocês? Christopher e Tiffany, os dois, por favor.
I'm struck. I think I've been wanting to know more about what that looks like clinically for you, for all of you who are practicing in such a diverse population. 56% Black and mixed inhabitants is what you said, Bruno, right? And yeah. Well, I think I mean, the first place I somehow intuitively I want to go to alchemy as something about the opportunity of diverse of what the opportunity of such of such diverse relationships embodied can provide psychically for someone. If we go the other way around, not always going from the inner conjunctio, but here we have an outer conjunctio is what you're looking at. And what does that mean? Well, how does that map onto our images, our ideas of belonging, of understanding, of individual and the collective? I feel like you are the expert on this. I'm curious what you're finding, experiencing.
Bruno, me ajuda?
Well, she said Bruno, but Luciana, it was actually you. Wow. Okay. So Tiffany identified the question as coming from Bruno, but I think it was actually Luciana who asked the question.
Sim, fui não. Eu pedi para o Bruno me ajudar na resposta para a Tiffany. Chamei o Bruno. Vem junto, Bruno.
Então, acho que é complicado para eles entenderem essa questão, porque eles não passam pelo que a gente passa em relação ao colorismo, né? A quantidade de pessoas que a gente tem aqui no Brasil que não sabem se identificar etnicamente é absurdamente grande. Então, a gente tem pessoas que estão nesse limbo que você falou. E talvez para a Tiffany, para o Christopher, não seja uma realidade. E aí eles querem a contrapartida nossa, né, de como que é essa relação.
Eu acho que isso aparece o tempo inteiro na clínica, né? Eu comecei eu cheguei nesse tema da mestiçagem porque eu estou fazendo um estudo, inclusive para o teatro da semana que vem, sobre intolerância, né? Então eu acho que tem uma tentativa de apagar isso que temos dentro que todos os brasileiros temos. Se não for no sangue, é no sincretismo cultural, né? E teve uma história no Brasil de tentativa de embranquecimento mesmo, para as pessoas serem vistas, para as pessoas existirem, né? Para os pretos existirem. Isso precisou ser. Muitos compraram a ideia mesmo, né, do embranquecimento. E agora a gente fica tentando um resgate. Essa coisa do pertencimento aparece muito, a falta de pertencimento aparece muito na clínica.
Go ahead, Chris.
There's a bit of a parallel in the Black experience in America to what you're talking about there, right? Not quite feeling like you're losing the roots, not quite knowing how to identify yourself, not being able to clearly say, this is my heritage. Your history is kind of being erased. And that certainly happened to Native Americans in America and Canada. We don't talk about the indigenous Mexicans with America coming down there as well, but there's been a move to erase, and I think it has a compensatory function. It wants to unite. A few years ago, we were really, really preoccupied with the images of mummies and vampires in cinema and TV, and now apocalyptic imagery is coming up. If we don't address what's happening inside, the call to unite, we're going to need to actually activate and act out some of these things outside of us. But we want a radical change. I think there's a yearning for humanity, for some kind of homogeneity. And maybe our perceptions will get us there when we recognize that we are human. There's no African human, Asian human. We're human. We're all related. So that's interesting. I'm I hate to hear that it's not better in Brazil than it is in America. My fantasy is that it was. I've had white Brazilians tell me that it was. I've had white Brazilians tell me there's no racism in Brazil. I have. I've had a Brazilian person come up to me and ask me, why was I attacking Jung? This person told me that in the 60s, the word nigger was used celebratorily in Brazil. People called each other that, like, hey, bro. Well, that happens in the Bronx, but we changed it. It's not the same word. I don't use it. But she actually came to me and said this to my face. And I told her, I don't think that's true. And she said it was true. Okay, so maybe it's true for her. But what's important is that we can't operate on the collective. We're in it. I bought this shirt. I didn't make it. It belongs to the collective. I rent this apartment. I didn't make it. It's kind of in the collective. TV, all collective. Jung, part of the collective now. Psychoanalysis, part of the collective. Where's Chris Carter? And we have to do the individual work. Only through individual do we have a collective that's better informed, that's more inclusive. There's very little way to do it on the grand scale. It's just individual reads the book and hopefully that makes a change. Individual hears the talk, hopefully that makes a change. Individual in analysis, individual who's discovering themselves through their art. It takes time, but we get really sucked into trying to operate on the collective level. And it's weird that for something that really prizes individuation, quite often we're talking about the collective when we're talking about the process. It's safer that way. And unfortunately, it's almost like because I've learned, because I passed my courses, because I bought the catalog or I've got the collective works, I'm individuated and I'm licensed and no, it doesn't work like that. See another question. Tiffany, I'm sorry if I talk too much. Go ahead.
No.
Gente, acho que a gente vai precisar encerrar. Deu nosso tempo. Se vocês quiserem colocar, fazer uma última colocação, por favor, sintam-se à vontade.
Ah,
Yeah.
Nada, Tiffany? Christopher? Estão satisfeitos? Muito obrigada pela presença, foi incrível o encontro, muito obrigada por todos que ficaram aqui até o fim. Foi uma maravilha.
I do want to say one more thing.
Diga, por favor.
One way we cannot try not to participate in the systemic racism is think about what race means to us and why we keep using the term. Because when we use it, we actively, in present day, step into the dynamic. We're taught to be proud of our race. That's like, be proud of your caste. And we buy into it. And when we're mixed culture, mixed ethnicities, I think so many of us here right now are, then it's, no, you know, what race are you is the wrong question. Right? So we want to step out of using it because then we're oppressing our neighbor when we do this. It's one thing going to the hospital and filling out a form, you have to identify your race. What is that? Ethnicity? Okay. My race? You want to know my color? Anyway, so that's one thing. I really want to push against that and think about how we look at our patients and are we racializing them? Because we're not making them, they're not as human as we are. That's my last word. Thank you. Tiffany, got a last word? Because we got to close.
Yeah, I think that was a good last word.
Okay.
My only last word is like the continual work to go in, to let yourself be undone again and again.
Thank you, Theosos.
It's great to see all of your
Christopher.
faces.
Obrigada, Tiffany. Muito obrigada. Pessoal, semana que vem a gente volta com o último Teasos do ano, que vai falar sobre perdoar o intolerável ou tolerar o imperdoável, desafios afetivos e éticos para uma psicologia pós-junguiana. Estaremos aqui, Marcos e eu, com certeza. Obrigada, gente. Obrigada, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Obrigada,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.